So last speaker of the session is Tyler Adkins. Tyler is a PhD student in the Department of Psychology at University of Michigan. And he will be talking about reward modulates cortical representation of action.
All right, thanks for the intro and thanks for everybody who came. So I'm going to start first with some background. So one thing that we know from actually a lot of prior work is that offering reward or punishment can enhance people's movement, both the speed and the accuracy of the movement. And so here I'm showing data from a SRT task where people are just typing out a sequence of button presses. And this shows that the gain in training of performing the sequence is greater for reward than controls. In a recent study out of my lab using a similar task showed that if you offer an identifying cue before the sequence is typed out, where this cue tells the participant what sequence they're going to have to type out, that the effects of reward are greater when they have this opportunity to prepare in advance. And so this suggests that there may be something important about planning or preparation for an action in terms of the effects of reward. And there's also some work that shows that representations of task in a multitasking task are enhanced by reward as well, specifically in planning areas like prefrontal cortex and SMA. And so this is a task where they're switching between either deciding between faces and houses or deciding between one syllable and two syllable words. And during preparation, they can predict which task they're about to do, and they can predict better from the brain activity if these participants are motivated by reward. And it's also been shown that in these sequence tasks that which sequence people are preparing to execute can also be decoded from similar brain regions prior to movement. And so this is showing a study where they were able to decode the upcoming sequence from SMA and dorsal premotor cortex during preparation. So our primary question is whether reward enhances action, specifically the performance of motor sequences, by modulating representations of those actions in the brain during preparation. So we had participants perform sequences that they had trained on previously, and we had them perform them with opportunities for rewards of $5, $10, or $30. And so the way this task goes is they see a cue which tells them how much money they could earn and which sequence they need to type next. And so red would be one sequence, green would be a different sequence. And so this particular sequence is 2, 4, 1, 3, 4, 1, 3, 2. And you could even try it yourself to see. And so they've trained on these sequences for a while, so they've gotten pretty fast. And what we want to see is what's going on in the brain when they're preparing to execute these actions. And does the amount of reward that we offer them somehow improve what's going on in the brain during this time? And so our fMRI analyses will focus on brain activity in response to this cue during the preparation of action. So first with behavior, what we see is that both the speed of movement and the accuracy of movement are enhanced on high reward trials. So this is speed in terms of keys pressed per second and accuracy in terms of being able to execute the full sequence without errors. And during preparation, we see elevated activity in a variety of regions where this activity, the amplitude of these brain responses scales linearly with the value of reward. And so we were particularly interested in these activations in these motor planning areas like the prefrontal cortex, SMA, as well as M1 or motor cortex. And so what we did was we looked at these areas of the brain that were modulated by reward, and we asked whether we could decode the upcoming action from patterns of activity across this network. And we found that we could. So each dot here is a subject, and training classifiers on patterns of activity throughout the brain allowed us to predict the upcoming action with upwards of 90% accuracy. There was quite a bit of variability across subjects, but this is greater than chance. And these are the regions that come out. So similar regions. This is actually quite a similar map to what we just saw. It's just more restricted. And we could also predict whether they were going to succeed or fail from this reward modulated activity. And it was actually easier for us to predict this than which action they were going to perform, but in similar regions again. And so these regions like prefrontal cortex, motor cortex, and SMA are jointly containing information about the reward, which actions being prepared, and whether it will be prepared or whether it will be performed successfully. And so next we looked at these specific regions of interest and asked whether reward enhanced the actual decoding of action. And so what we find is that in these regions, specifically in pre-SMA, we see the strongest effect that decoding of action is enhanced on these $30 trials. And this is significant after permutation testing with 10,000 permutations. And finally, we looked at whether this decoding of action, and remember this decoding is from preparatory activity, so they haven't performed the action yet, but whether the decoding of action was linked to their subsequent behavioral performance. And so what we see is that in these regions of interest, specifically in SMA, those trials where we could correctly decode their upcoming action, they're actually more likely to perform that sequence successfully. So in conclusion, first we showed that reward enhanced both the speed and accuracy of these motor sequences. We also saw that during movement preparation, many brain areas were modulated by reward, and specifically some motor planning areas. And some of these areas also contain information about the upcoming action and whether that action would be performed successfully. And then our ROI analysis showed that in some of these regions of interest, these motor planning areas, decoding of the upcoming action was enhanced on high reward trials and coincided with improved future behavioral performance. And so together, these results suggest that rewards may enhance action by enhancing representations of those actions that are used in planning. So thank you to my advisor, Taraz Lee, and our lab, the COCO lab, Cognition, Control, and Action. And also thank you to the Functional MRI lab for making all this possible.
Great. Thank you so much, Tyler. We have lots of time for questions. And I see that Sevgi has a question. They ask, shouldn't action decoding inherently include performance decoding?
Yeah, and they are highly overlapping these. Sorry, I'm sharing the wrong screen here. So these information maps, they're both coming from these regions, and they do highly overlap. So I think that probably action decoding, and this is a question that we've gotten from reviewers as well, is what exactly are we decoding when we say we're decoding action? And we can't be sure whether we're decoding the specific sequence, the first button, the visual cue, or some difference in skill level, perhaps. So that's certainly something that we'd like to look into in future work to try to really get at what's being decoded. But I think the term action is broad enough to kind of encompass all these different possibilities.
We have another question from Michael. The effects you're talking about seem to be somewhat similar to pre-stimulus effects on memory encoding. Do you think these are comparable? And do you think they would be impaired in older adults as memory pre-stimulus effects tend to be?
I'm not aware of those effects, sadly, but it would be very interesting to look at these effects in different populations. And yeah, I think they definitely could, it could be affected by age if there's a link there between this preparatory activity and this effect that you were talking about.
So again, I have a question, but I might have missed that. So how do you do the decoding? Is that a multivoxel pattern type analysis, or?
Yeah, so right here, we're using a whole brain classifier, similar to if you were to run like an SVM on all of the brain activity at once. But this is a special type of classifier called the SpaceNet classifier. And it uses some special regularization and spatial priors to get more interpretable maps out of your classifier. But ultimately, it's just kind of like a giant regression where you're trying to predict the label using all of the brain activity at once.
Okay.
That's a question.
Yeah, go for it, Toby.
Yeah.
Your decoding of success or failure, it's really, really clear, really strong, really high accuracy.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if this is a question you can really answer based on those results, but what is it that's leading to that high accuracy? What is kind of being represented there that relates to success?
I find it really fascinating, although difficult to interpret, like what exactly it means to predict success or failure. The reason we did this is because we wanted to home in on regions that were actually practically relevant, that is relevant to the future behavior. But yeah, what exactly the information is there, I think is really fascinating. And you could, that could be an interesting future study. Yeah.
Cool.
Sorry, I don't have more to say.
No,
but
I didn't. Just wondered if we had any kind of speculation more than any concrete answer.
Yeah. But I mean, it could, if I could speculate, maybe it's something like they're worrying about failure, or if they're distracted, or any sort of things that could be going wrong that would allow the classifier to predict they're going to fail, I think could be driving this.
Cool.
We have more questions. Aaron asks, do you see any reward or action-related modulation in basal ganglia?
It's a great question. And if you look here, my neuroanatomy is not that great, but I'm pretty sure this is basal ganglia area down here. And so you do see reward modulation, but then when you get to sequence decoding and performance decoding, there's surprising lack of activation in those areas. So we didn't focus on basal ganglia for that reason. But it's very surprising to me that it wouldn't be playing a critical role in this kind of incentive motivated behavior.
Cool. I think we have time for one last question by Peter. Have you considered looking at this in terms of a competitive queuing framework? See, for example, papers by Kornisheva. I think your reward effects would suggest a greater separation between the representation of individual sequence elements, which she has linked to improved performance.
So again, this is something I haven't heard of, this competitive queuing, but you may have seen I wrote down a note, so I'll certainly look into that. That sounds very interesting.
Okay, are there any other questions or comments? Great, then I really enjoyed the session. Thank you so much to all three of you for doing such a good job. Those were amazingly clear presentations, so bravo on that.
Thank you.
Thank you to the audience for